All right, we're going to keep on this journey, and now we're moving into the gymnosperms. So we're moving on to the seed plants. So these first appear in the fossil record about 425 million years ago. Now, I talked about briefly about seeds, but they have that protective seed coat, which is going to protect them from drying out and also predators, and it's going to provide food storage for the embryonic plant. Now, if you look at the diversity of seeds, as I mentioned, I worked in a seed lab before for a few years before I went and did my PhD, and there's so much diversity. I know more about seeds than I care to admit, but there is so much variety, and many of them have lots of adaptations to help with dispersal. Now we're going to break it up into two groups, the gymnosperms, which we call the naked seeds, and the angiosperms, which is the next lecture, which are the covered seeds. So you're going to see an ovule enclosed in a sporophyte. Now we're going to break them up into four major phyla, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So when we're talking about gymnosperms, we are talking about the naked seeds. Now this is where we're going to get a little bit more diverse. We're going to have separate female and male gametophytes. So you're going to have pollen cones and ovulate cones, and we're going to talk about the conifer life cycle on the next slide. Now, they're going to rely on pollination by wind and insects, and they do go through that prominent alternation of generations, but you're going to see the more dominant sporophyte phase, which is going to be reduced male and female gametophytes are also going to reside on. Now, these groups are going to be heterosporous, so they have both the male and female parts. Now, there's four major phyla that we'll talk about, and there's, some species. It's not as diverse as you're going to see as the angiosperms. So with the conifer life cycle, as I mentioned, I'd bring up a few of them. There are heterospores, so there's going to be two different types of spores. You're going to have the male microspores and female megaspores. So here's your sporophyte, the mature tree. As I mentioned, you're going to have female cones. They're going to grow in the upper branches, and the male cones are going to grow in the lower branches. Now, think about springtime. Oh, spring. You start to see large amounts of yellow pollen being released. So pollen is just tree sperm, all right? So what happens is the wind blows and all that tree sperm goes in the air. So what's going to happen is all that tree sperm is going to blow in the air, and then it's going to go and land on the female cones. So some of them will land there. Now pollination is when we go through and have the pollen grain land on the female ovulate right there. And that's going to, first thing it's going to do is have the initiation of the pollen tube growth. So what's going to happen is this pollen tube is slowly going to grow as a generative cell. The pollen grain divides into two haploid nuclei right here by mitosis. At fertilization, the sperm and the ovule are going to unite, and it's going to unite with the haploid nucleus, and it's going to form the diploid cell. And eventually that diploid will lead to the actual seeds, which are 2N right there. Now this process can take up to 2 years, so it's like plants take a long time. Now here's a video that kind of explains it in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, I didn't want to go and overwhelm you with details about life cycles of plants. So let's talk about the groups a little bit. So the first one is phylum Coniferophyta, and this is probably the one you're most familiar with. So this is going to be your pine, your spruce, your fir, hemlock, and cypress trees. Your redwood is an example of the tallest, and the bristlecone is an example of the oldest. Now you're going to find these in more your cool, temperate, and drier regions of the world, and they're going to be kind of associated with being evergreen and drought tolerant. Now they are an essential source for timber, paper, and other things, and you're going to have like 100 species native to just the northern hemisphere where we do have those colder environments. Now with these guys, they're going to have the needle-like leaves. So they're going to cluster into 2 or 5 needles. So it's about to be Christmas time when I'm recording these. And with these needles, they have this like waxy covering on there, this resin. And what they do is they retard water loss, but also deters insects and fungal attacks, which is kind of cool too. Now, it does have the bark that allows it to survive fires and sub-zero temperatures. So these are actually really cool. Now, the phylum Cycadophyta, are the cycads. You're going to find these mostly in the tropics and subtropics. These are going to be slow-growing plants, and people see those leaves and often mistake them for palms. But they're going to have this large cone that's going to be pollinated by beetles rather than wind, so using those insects to help them. These used to be really, really popular in the age of dinosaurs, and we only have about 100 species, but commonly these will be used as ornamental plants. And then the next one is the Gonidophyta, or the gonidophytes, and these are the closest relative to the angiosperms, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. But when we look at the molecular analogy of them, they are closer to the conifers, so sometimes your DNA will kind of trick you a little bit. Now, they are the only gymnosperms with vessels in their xylem, so that's something unique to them. But you're going to see these broad leaves that's going to be associated with this phylum right here. They do form a great source of medicine. So a Friedger species is a source of decongestant ephedrine, similar to amphetamine right there. And then the last group is the phylum Ginkgophyta, or the ginkgos. And this used to be a lot more diverse, but now there's only one species that actually exists, which is the Ginkgo biloba. Now it has these fan-shaped leaves with dichotomous venation pattern. Historically, you can only find them in Japan and China, but they are really used in landscaping, and you can no longer find them in the wild. What's interesting about these guys is they are resistant to pollution. So I know that wasn't a lot, but here's some review videos about gymnosperms, and then, of course, credit for my images.